What's up, Sugi here, and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. I'm so excited that we just got confirmation through Canon rumors that the Canon M50 Mark II should be announced before the end of 2020. Today I'm going to talk about the features that we already know about, a few that I really think they should include, some consequences that I think are coming because of this release, and why I'm so excited that Canon is continuing the EFM line. Now, people kept telling me that Canon is finished with EFM cameras, and I kept saying that it's so hard for me to believe that they'll stop when the M50 is possibly the best-selling APS-C mirrorless camera ever. So let's get to the Mark II. So starting out with the first new feature, we're going to talk about the 32.5 megapixel APS-C CMOS sensor. This would be the same upgraded sensor that we saw on the M6 Mark II and the 90D. And I was a little bit surprised by this, and it might mean the end of 24 megapixel APS-C cameras from Canon, unless they keep it for something like the M200 replacement. I also think including this sensor on the M50 Mark II will absolutely crush M6 Mark II sales, because I don't see it offering enough of an advantage for most users. Now, the M6 Mark II does have better ergonomics with dedicated controls for aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and it's got a more compact design with a flip screen, which some people prefer. There are also some functionality advantages for the M6 Mark II, like focus bracketing and interval shooting. Now, both cameras offer in-body time-lapse, but the M6 Mark II also has an option for interval shooting, and that's going to give you a higher resolution time-lapse and give you some added functionality. The M6 Mark II also offers longer shutter speeds when using in-body time-lapse, and it'll be interesting to see if any of these features trickle down to the M50 Mark II. But regardless, I don't know if those are enough of an advantage for enough users to make them choose the M6 Mark II. I think a lot of people are going to look at things like the built-in viewfinders on the M50 Mark II and the fully articulating screen, and they'll see them as much more useful features for most of what they do. Also, one of the biggest problems for photographers using the M6 Mark II is the lack of hot shoe functionality when you're using the optional EVF. So if you install the electronic viewfinder, you're using the hot shoe, and then you can't use an external flash or a trigger, which really limits what you can do with this camera. And now there's going to be an M50 Mark II with a built-in viewfinder, the same upgraded sensor, and you'll have the ability to use either an external flash or a trigger. And I have a tutorial about using off-camera flash and why it's such a powerful feature, so if you're interested, check the link up in the corner and in the description. All right, moving on to the next feature, we're looking at the DIGIC X processor. So the M50 and the M6 Mark II both have the DIGIC 8 processor. Not really sure what happened to the DIGIC 9. If you know what happened to the DIGIC 9, let me know. But this added processing power is definitely going to contribute to some of the features that we're going to talk about next, starting with the newer dual pixel autofocus system, or what Canon has referenced as the dual pixel CMOS autofocus 2. Now, this is the same advanced implementation that we saw on the new R6 and the R5, both of which are obviously significantly more expensive than the M50 Mark II will be. We should be getting dual pixel autofocus with eye detection at every resolution and frame rate, and more advanced eye autofocus for photos. I'm curious about whether we're going to get the animal eye autofocus, and that's one of the things that I love about my Sony cameras, because I take so many pictures of our dogs. And speaking of, we just rescued a new puppy, and her name is Mac. She was crazy skinny when we got her. We've been feeding her back to her proper weight. She's super sweet, and she's doing really well with her house training. All right, but back to the M50 Mark II autofocus. One of the things that I've always liked about Canon is autofocus, and I love seeing that they're continuing to improve this excellent system. Like, for me and how I shoot, reliable autofocus is a requirement. So I don't always use it. Like, for example, two of my cameras right now, like this one and that one, are on manual focus, and one of them is on autofocus. But I need to know that when I need it, it'll work. And that's something that I've always gotten from Canon when it comes to autofocus for video. All right, so moving on to a few other features that people are going to be excited about. We can shoot it up to 4K 60 with no crop, with dual pixel autofocus. So with the original M50, if you wanted to shoot in 4K, first of all, you lost dual pixel autofocus, and now it was using a contrast detection system, which was worse. And then second of all, there was an additional 1.7 time or X crop. So with the new M50 Mark II, we're not getting that crop. We're getting a higher frame rate for 4K. So if you're editing your videos in 24 frames per second or at 30 frames per second, you can slow down 4K 60 either by 2 times to 30 frames per second or by 2.5 times to 24 frames per second, and then get slow motion. And that's gonna be another advantage over the M6 Mark II. The M6 Mark II doesn't have a crop in 4K, and you still get dual pixel autofocus, but you can only shoot it up to 4K 30. Now moving on to a feature that was not included that I know some people were curious about and some people are gonna be disappointed about. There's no in-body image stabilization. And I'm not talking about electronic or digital image stabilization, which will still be there. I'm talking about the sensor shifting image stabilization that we're seeing on something like the R5. For me, that's not that big a deal at this price point. I really wasn't expecting it. And I think that if you're using a wide stabilized lens, you should be just fine. If you're using a wide lens, you'll be fine anyways. And if you want to check out some of my favorite vlogging lenses for any EFM camera, I'll put a link up in the corner and in the description. All right, so next we're going to move on to a photography feature. So the M50 can shoot it up to 10 frames per second. The M6 Mark II can shoot it up to 14 frames per second. Well, with the M50 Mark II, again, it's gonna match up with the M6 Mark II, and we're now getting 14 frames per second. So you're getting 4 additional shots for every second of shooting, and it's more likely that you're gonna capture exactly what you're trying to. Another feature that photographers are gonna appreciate is we're getting an upgraded EVF with a similar resolution to what we're seeing on the EOS R6. So I never really had an issue with the viewfinder on the M50, but I know some people wanted a better viewfinder, so guess what? You're getting one. Moving on to the next feature that was reported, there's gonna be a single card slot, just like on the original M50. I really wasn't expecting them to put dual cards in this type of camera. While if you're watching this, you probably know that you can get fantastic results out of the camera, it is targeted at a beginner, and adding a second card slot would just either increase the size of the body and it would probably increase the price. And I just don't see enough M50 users wanting 2 cards. What I don't know is whether we're getting UHS 1 or UHS 2 card slots. I really hope it's UHS 2 because, you know, it's like 2021 almost. So yeah, I really hope it's UHS 2. All right, so those are all the features that were reported so far. And now I want to talk about a few things that were not reported, but I really hope that they include. And the first one is a clean HDMI output. So we know that the M50, the original one, does not have a clean HDMI output. And while Canon did release the EOS webcam utility, which lets you stream with the M50, it is at a lower resolution than what the camera can actually do. Now you can use the HDMI output and then lose autofocus if you want better resolution and better frame rate option, but really they should add clean HDMI output to the M50 Mark II and everyone will just be happy. Again, that is something that we have on the M6 Mark II, so it's a more powerful camera for streaming, but if they add it to the Mark II, that'll be great, but again, I don't know why someone would buy this, but I'll get to this at the end. Another feature that I hope they're adding to the M50, which neither one of these cameras have, is 1080p at 120 frames per second with autofocus. So the M6 Mark II can do 1080p 120 if you want to do slow motion, but then you lose audio and you lose autofocus. And I can live without audio because I rarely will use my audio from my slow motion footage, but I want autofocus. And now on to another feature that exists on the M6 Mark II, and that's USB-C charging. Now, I hope they include that with the M50 Mark II, and not just USB-C charging, but I want to be able to power the camera through USB-C indefinitely. So I don't want the battery to be drained, or at least drained really slowly so that I can use this camera for streaming without needing a coupler, which is what I do right now, and it works, but it's sort of, you have to take out the battery and put the coupler in and then switch that. So if we could use USB-C and power delivery to power the M50 Mark II, that would be awesome. All right, so now on to another feature that I really hope they add with the M50 Mark II, and I'm talking about a silent shutter. And not like the silent mode that exists on the M50. So there is an actual silent mode, it's under scene, but then you can't use manual exposure, so it's really limiting. It's like on auto and then it's silent. No, I want just silent shutter in manual or aperture priority or shutter priority so I can do exactly what I want and I don't want to hear the shutter. Again, for those times when I want to use an electronic shutter, if I need it to be quiet. And that sort of brings me to an audio feature which I hope to get. On the M6 Mark II, you can see the audio levels, but you can't change them while you're recording. On the M50, you can't even see the audio levels when you're recording if you're actually looking at the scene. So I hope that with the M50 Mark II, you can both see and edit the levels while you're recording. That's super important. Another cool feature that the M6 Mark II has that maybe they'll port over to the M50 Mark II is raw burst mode, which allows for 30 frames at 18 megapixels. So you're getting burst shooting at 30 frames per second at 18 megapixels. So you're not getting the full sensor readout, but still that's really cool if you want to get a ton of raw images in a very short period of time so you're capturing an exact moment. And since the M6 Mark II can already do this with the DIGIC 8, the M50 can't do it with the DIGIC 8, but the M50 Mark II will have the DIGIC 10. I don't see why I wouldn't be able to do it. All right, so this is what we know about the M50 Mark II so far, and we should have complete specs fairly soon. I think this is going to be another home run from Canon. Current M50 users who want a very similar user experience but with upgraded specs like 4K 60, better autofocus for photography and video, no crop in 4K, and autofocus in 4K, a higher resolution sensor, faster burst shooting, and a better electronic viewfinder. I think they're gonna have enough of a reason to upgrade. And then people who wanted 4K or a higher resolution sensor but didn't want to deal with the lack of built-in EVF or the flip screen on the M6 Mark II can now get exactly what they want. But what I'm curious about is if you're watching this and you already own an M50, would you upgrade based on the specs that I mentioned? And if you were thinking about buying an M6 Mark II, will this new camera change your mind? I don't want you to think that the M6 Mark II is a bad option. I use mine all the time. I really do value having dedicated controls for aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, especially for photography, but it's gonna be interesting to see what I reach for once I have the M50 Mark II. Just as a reminder, there is no official announcement from Canon and definitely no release date. And we're also still waiting for the 5 upcoming EFM lenses, the 15 and 52 f2. It's gonna be a 62 f4 macro and 18 to 45 f2.8 to f4. And then there is a 100 to 300 f5.6 to f8, which I can't wait to get my hands on. I really hope you enjoyed this discussion of the M50 Mark II. If you did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon. I really hope you enjoyed this discussion of the M50 Mark II. If you did, please let me know by giving this video a thumb. Why is this camera upside down? I don't even know.